And now I'd like to introduce Christopher Moore. You probably know that he studied the history of art at Trinity College Dublin. And from 1983 to 86, he served as the curator of Castletown House and then became assistant historic buildings representative in Northern Ireland, serving from 1987 to 89. From 1990 to 2013, he worked as a specialist decorator, mainly on historic building projects in Ireland and the UK, focusing on traditional finishes and the creation of atmospheric restorations. In 2000, Christopher joined the board of the Castletown Foundation, where he was particularly concerned with the conservation of the contents and interiors. And from 2013 to 18, he functioned as chairman of the foundation. He also served a term as board member of the Irish Georgian Foundation and currently lives in Oxfordshire and Kilkenny. Christopher is delivering the closing keynote address at this year's Williamsburg Antiques Forum. I hope some of you will be there. And we are fortunate indeed tonight to have him address us as well. So please join me in welcoming Chris Moore. Thank you so much.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Dale. It's just so interesting spending the afternoon wandering through the university and soaking up the atmosphere of what I think, in the context of this evening, we can call sort of adaptive classicism. You know, a building that is neoclassical, that is neo-Palladian, that is actually functioning and has been creatively adapted to its country. And I think it's no coincidence that the two buildings in this country that have always resonated most strongly to me are Shirley Plantation and Drayton in South Carolina. And, you know, they too are buildings that are true to their Palladian Italian tradition, but they are quintessentially American buildings at the same time. So when we look at Ireland, at Irish Neo-Palladianism, I want to look at the characteristics, I want to look at its evolution, at its eccentricities, and forgive me if I dwell a little bit on this, I want to look at where it came from, because the extraordinary nature of Irish Neo-Palladianism, I think, is that it was reactive, and it was such, it was evolving in such a sort of crucial moment in the early 18th century. There are two books that you probably all know, or at least one of them I'm sure you know, which I think are relevant. One is Eddie McParland's masterful Public Architecture in Ireland. It is mathematical, it's accurate, it's deeply researched and knowledgeable, and traces the course of the evolution from the 17th century of public classical architecture. And the other is Giles Worsley's Classical Architecture in Britain, which is a more general commentary on, and it's a slightly iconographic approach to conventional architectural history. And instead of a sort of a sequential development of styles, he argues that actually styles coexisted at the same time at different points, either in the 17th century or during the 18th century. And I think that's very important for trying to understand what was going on in Ireland. Obviously, if we're looking at Neo-Palladianism, there are two foundation people. One, of course, is Inigo Jones at the beginning of the 17th century, this brilliant court artist who made his two trips in 1598 and 1613 to Italy. He came in direct contact with Vincenzo Scamozzi, Palladio's follower, his pupil. And for the purposes, and he brought the Renaissance effectively to the English court in the years before the Cromwellian period. But for the purposes of tonight, I think that what's important about Jones is his adaptation of the published designs of Palladio and Serlio, particularly the Palazzo designs. And on the one hand, you have the Maltravers house of 1638, which which he designs and becomes the kind of the prototype for so many English 17th century A-styler classical houses with high-pitched roofs and dormers, dolls' houses. And on the other hand, on the larger scale, somewhere like Coleshill, which although is not directly designed by Jones, is a house produced by his circle and is an iconic building, as we'll see, because it had such a huge knock-on effect. And the other key foundation person is, of course, Lord Burlington. And, you know, so he is this aristocratic patron, this repeated grand tourist, this collector, this amateur architect, and the creator of the quintessential Neo-Palladian Chiswick, which is this brilliant synthesis of the antique, of the Renaissance, into a building that works in early 18th century England. He was the third Earl of Burlington, the fourth Earl of Cork. He owned 60,000 acres in Ireland. It doesn't seem he ever came. He doesn't seem to have, other than drawing an income, a direct interest. But inevitably, Burlington had a huge influence, as we'll see, on Irish Neo-Palladianism. But what I'm going to try and argue is that, you know, Irish Palladianism has its roots in, you know, this sort of English tradition of Jones and Burlington, but it's more. And a quintessential example of this sameness and its oddity is a house like this called Hamwood, built in the between the late 60s and the early 1770s. Main block, quadrants, wings. Seems very conventional. Symmetrical. No central front door. And you may correct me, because I'm not the academic here. You guys are much more learned than I am. But the entry is, I believe, uniquely through this pavilion, along a quadrant corridor into a sequence of reception rooms. And the other wing or pavilion was a schoolroom. Sensibly, the children were placed at far end of the curved corridor out of their parents' earshot. So to set the scene, Ireland had a tumultuous, as you probably know to a degree, 17th century history. So there were rebellions in the 1640s, there was the mid-century Cromwellian invasion, there were the Williamite Wars of the 1690s. It was not a period conducive to patronage building, classical architecture, or the evolution of any kind of stable architecture. And to set the scene as well, these two watercolors done in the 1760s are of country houses within the close proximity of Dublin. So there was Dublin, the seat of English power and administration in Ireland. There was the Pale, the region around that. And these houses are within 3 miles of the city itself. In 1760, barely disguising their medieval fortified background. So we have got this tumultuous 17th century that literally in a decade and a half was transformed in the early 18th century. And I think these two paintings, both of about 1740, these bird's eye views, give an idea of the sort of mood that Neo-Palladianism, when it was introduced, met with in Ireland. Howth Castle on the left-hand side, the seat of the St. Lawrence family from the late 12th century, a couple of miles from the city of Dublin on the shores of Dublin Bay, painted in the mid-century. Its military past is barely hidden by the insertion of a few symmetrical windows. On the right-hand side, we have Carton, further away from Dublin, but within the Pale region, and we have this Palladian ensemble, the main block quadrants wings being slapped onto an existing 17th century building, and this axial French garden being plonked down as an act of civilization. Both the architecture and the garden, the maths of the landscape are suppressing the chaos, in inverted commas, of the 17th century. So the Neo-Palladianism, when it arrives, is fighting chaos, introducing civilization in a very short period of time. This is not to say that classicism didn't exist at the end of the Elizabethan period. And in the middle, we've got, a very handsome Serlian volute, part of a chimney piece that is straight from the pages of Serlio. This dates from the 1560s, from a castle in Tipperary in the southeast of the country. And over here, we have, in the early 17th century, a triumphal arch that is slightly naive, but given that it's built in the wilds of the west of Ireland, it is a noble attempt to, introduce a level of classicism. But it was very tentative, and as I say, was completely countered by the unsettled nature of Ireland in the 17th century. So there was this dramatic moment with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, who had been accompanied during the Cromwellian period by James Butler, illustrious ancestor of our friend Cordelia here. And so Butler had spent the Commonwealth on the continent soaking up the court of Louis XIV and all the sophistication of mid to late-ish 17th century France. He comes back to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant in 1662. He finds his family seat at Kilkenny Castle in the middle of the country, destroyed by Cromwell a decade or so previously, and he converts it with his wife Elizabeth into a continental schloss in the 1680s with frescoed walls, tapestry hung enfilades of apartment reception rooms, rock crystal chandeliers, and the greatest symbol of the Renaissance and the Baroque being introduced in one building in a couple of years is the Triumphal Arch that he commissioned Hugh May, Charles II's court architect, to insert into the Bourne Wall of Kilkenny. Now, it wasn't finished until the early years of the 18th century, but the concept, this is a symbol of change. As Lord Lieutenant, he transformed Dublin in the 1680s as well. It was Dublin, what he established it as the capital of Ireland. He enclosed commonage to create squares. He created streetscapes through the medieval muddle, and most sensibly built a large hospital for retired soldiers to keep them apart and quiet and fed and, supplicant to the west of the city, which is actually the first fully classical building in Ireland, the Royal Hospital, designed by the Surveyor General, Sir William Robinson, in the first half of the 1680s. It is an A-styler classical building. It is actually also a Baroque building, but the artisans that fitted it out were nearly all Huguenots. So after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, as you know, a lot of Huguenots left France, and so James Tabery fitted out the woodwork for the Great Hall, and you have this extraordinary continental plasterwork being introduced into Ireland. So, it's a very strange situation. You have this devastated country, and then these isolated examples of quite avant-garde buildings being introduced. But it is argued there were unfortified A-styler classical buildings dotted around the countryside, and some of them survived into the age of photography, notably this wonderful artisan mannerist house, Aircourt, in the west of Ireland, which had an extraordinary interior of carved oak, great 3-foot-long consoles supporting the roof, but it's thought this was all carried out by continental imported craftsmen as well. One of these early houses that survives, Bewley, on the east coast of Ireland, built over a long period from about 1670 until the early years of the 18th century, and it follows the Maltravers, Inigo Jones Doll's House formula. It's rather old-fashioned with its top-heavy roof, overhanging cornice, almost Elizabethan panelled brick chimney stacks. But look at the quality of the detail. The volutes that support the cornice are pure scamozzi. So you're getting this trickle of classical information coming in. This is a building built on the East Coast where there's lots of trade going on between the local town, Drogheda, and England. But you're getting this trickle that is growing into a bit of a stream towards the end, the last years of the 17th century. And the figures prove the change that Ormond, as Lord Lieutenant, brought in between 1670 and 1750. The population of Dublin went from 15,000 to 70,000. And so in the course of the late 17th and the early 18th century, the medieval birdcage timber buildings were replaced by gabled brick and stone structures. And after the accession of William of Orange to the throne in 1690, you get these brick-built terraces with these curvilinear gables known as Dutch billies, which obviously have their origins in the Low Countries, particularly Holland. And then we come to the benchmark of 1700, and Ireland is suddenly peaceful. It's stable. It's got a stable Tory government to begin with under Queen Anne. It is a different landscape, and almost immediately you get the building by prosperous merchants and the growing middle class of Jonesian, A-styler, handsome brick houses with flush windows, box frames, elaborate door cases, and wainscoted interiors. A type, that was, endemic throughout England. You're familiar with, certainly on the east coast of this country, I suppose, up to about 1750. Queen Anne, obviously, but the change is interesting. And what's also interesting that the public buildings that are built in the first few years of the 18th century are following the domestic formula. So this is a guild hall built in 1703 in Dublin, which is essentially a Queen Anne house that happens to have a great hall stuck at one end of it. And other buildings that survive still have their early thick paned sash windows, and box sashes, and which are flush to the surface of the walls. But Ireland's byline is boom or bust. And so you've got a terrace here built between 1699 and 1705. It's in the university in Dublin, Trinity College, this Elizabethan university, and there were 3 ranges of accommodation blocks erected by the Surveyor General, Sir William Robinson. And this is it today. It has an Edwardian roofline now. Brick, unornamented, slightly exaggerated piano nobile, but almost like an artisan mannerist edifice. 5 years after it was completed, you get this being built by the next Surveyor General, Sir Thomas Burr. This is the old library building, built over a 20-year period from if my date's right, actually, 1710 onwards. It's not built of brick. It's a public building that is being now erected in Dublin limestone, which is known as Dublin Calp. It is unornamented in terms of it is 3 stories with just these serried rows of sash windows. But, and the change is coming, the entablature is crisply carved in the Corinthian order. It is an building of industrial proportions. Apart from the Royal Hospital, which was built outside the city, the low, huddled medieval city of Dublin had never seen a structure of this scale. 27 bays long, pavilions on either end, with accommodation for the librarian, the School of Philosophy at the far end, sandwiching a 141-foot long library occupying the upper 2 floors, all standing on this arcaded basement or arcaded ground level story, so the air would circulate, to keep the books from being damp. So McParlin says this room, finished in the early 1730s, is the first overtly antique room in Ireland, with its Serlio-inspired hexagonal ceiling. So, no, we're not at the Palladian stage yet, but we've moved from brick diminutive Queen Anne to industrial classicism in the space of very short period of time. And why I think this is important for when we do, in a minute, look at some early Palladian buildings is that this building seems to have produced a legacy of Irish country houses. Damer House, built in 1730, Doneraile Court sometime in the 1740s, in Cork in the south, in the Midlands here in Tipperary. And they are following this unornamented, this almost tower house mentality of tall, gaunt buildings that are making this very strong classical statement, but it's also a social and a political statement of solidity and domination. So Burr is a really interesting man, Sir Thomas Burr. He was a surveyor general, he was a military engineer, he was a landowner. No portrait of him exists, but he was clearly ambitious. And while the library was being built, he built the first flat, how would you describe this? Facade without gables. The standard Dublin house until at least 1730 was either triangular or curvilinear gabled. But this terrace of buildings, which are not houses, they were actually civil service buildings, built in part of Dublin Castle, is the precursor to the whole legacy of Dublin terraces for the rest of the 18th and much of the 19th century, for which Ireland has become so famous. Of the fenestration dates from the early 19th century. It obviously had, a flusher, cruder sash originally, but the tall, early segmental pedimented door cases show their early date. So he was an adventurer and he was pushing the boundaries. And just before I enter the Palladian phase, I just want to show you a little bit of the sort of range of surviving buildings from this pre-Palladian but very classical era that you get around Ireland. And at the bottom of the economic scale, you've got this, what we call cottage Georgian type. And you guys will have a much clearer idea of where the roots of this design comes from. It's not a type that's common in Ireland or England, but it's obviously a small merchant's house of about 1720, early because of its narrow openings, its flush windows, it's brick built. It's a formal little structure with charming interior, with wafer thin wainscoted divisions inside. At the other end, economic end, we have this extraordinary country house in County Cork called Palace Anne, which again is an A-styler building which happens to have pavilions. But why this crazy skyline? Does it relate to the urban structures like the Dutch Billies, or does it in fact relate to, in some way, to the sort of English Jacobean tradition of country houses with these theatrical profiles? The other anomaly that you get is the presence of very Baroque ironwork. And, so this must be the Huguenot tradition at play. And the ironwork was mainly in formal gardens up to the middle of the century. And occasionally you get these sort of flamboyant occurrences with these bizarre sort of pilasters flanking this arched door in a thatched brick cottage. It's a dower house in County Cork. And then the final sort of act of madness before sanity prevails is this extraordinary villa built by a bachelor and his sister. He was the Lord Chancellor, Marmaduke Coghill, over a very extended period from about 1710 till the end of the 20s as his country house. And it's sort of crazy because the entrance, if it was built of brick, would be a conventional late Queen Anne arrangement, except that the entrance is from the ground level. The adjoining south facade bears no relation. It's just a sort of, every good architectural rule has been broken, void over niche, niche over solid, crazy clustering of Baroque columns, and then this sort of cross-eyed arrangement of coats of arms over niches and other extravaganza in the middle. It's a very peculiar building associated with two people who we'll come across now, Alessandro Galilei and Edward Lovett Pearce, but who did what is not at all clear. inside, it's incredibly sophisticated. The entire piano nobile, we would call it first floor, you call it second floor, do you? Yeah, is a double apartment of oak, Balection paneled, wainscoted spaces of the finest caliber. A couple of feet from that crazy south front is this little building. And this is the moment of change in Ireland. What it was built for, nobody knows. Was it a garden pavilion? Was it an architect's model, which is a distinct possibility? And it is almost certain it's the work of this man, Alessandro Galilei. So Alessandro Galilei is a young Italian found in Rome by a man called John Molesworth, who was the British envoy in the Tuscan court. And he and his father, Robert, who were both Irish and had huge estates around Dublin, they were part of what was called the New Junta of Architecture, set up to try and counter Baroque architecture and introduce a national style of architecture in England. About 1714, they were active. Galilei comes to England for a couple of years, and being Catholic and not speaking English, he gets no employment. And he is brought to Dublin by John Molesworth in 1718, where he stays for a few months. And he, it is believed, designed this little building. And compared to that, the rational harmony, the balance, the lucidity of this little facade is Palladio coming finally to the country. He didn't stay. He left Galilei and he went on in the 1720s to design his most famous facade, that of St. John Lateran in Rome. So before he left, he produced some sketch designs for a palace outside Dublin. And this palace was for the most important landowner and politician in Ireland, William Connolly. And the house is Castletown. And Castletown has a slightly dazzling array of architects, Galilei, Sir Thomas Burr, Edward Lovett Pearce, and others involved in its conception. It was started in 1718. It was more or less complete after a hiatus in the early 20s by 1729. It's a complicated building because it is an Italian palazzo. It is the Palazzo Farnese. It is a wall of unornamented windows. The architraves were only put in place sometime after the mid-1730s. It could be a freestanding palazzo 13 miles outside Dublin on the banks of Ireland's second river, the River Liffey. But it's not. It's attached tangentially by these colonnades to these flanking wings. So it's a palazzo with colonnades and wings. It's a deeply formal house, which is not surprising given, you know, the sort of that everything was so axial and in the early 18th century. But there is this hierarchy of materials. The main block is built of this silver limestone from the Eastern Midlands of Ireland, and the wings which are supporting are in this mottled local Dublin limestone calp. It is obviously a Palladian ensemble. It is like the Villa Bador. It is basically a main block with wings where there are stables and kitchens. It established this formula in Ireland that was, you know, the rule for the rest of the 18th century for these Palladian layouts. But it's more than that. And this is why, you know, I bored you by, you know, this sort of muddled the first 3 decades of the 18th century, because there is this overlap of styles. The back of Castletown, which has its original fenestration in terms of the piano nobile windows, are longer than the ground floor windows. They were altered on the entrance front at the end of the 18th century. It relates to Vitruvius Botanicus, to Inigo Jones's Chevening in Kent. And ironically, a mile away from Castletown, built at exactly the same time, is a house called Oakley Park, designed by the Surveyor General, Sir Thomas Burr, which is not 13 bays, but a sort of a concertinaed version. They're obviously related. And then you have this extra level when you look at this house in the west of Ireland in County Clare, built about 1730 onwards, by this interesting family, the Rothery family, who are master masons and architects. And while Castletown was being built, a member of this family called Joseph Rothery was living in the local village beside Castletown and was responsible for at least one other building. There has to be a link up between those. Castletown was designed by a committee. There is no question of that. And who did what is part of the sort of the architectural game that can be played. This is the saloon door on the garden front. This is the entrance to a church in Dublin that was both designed by the Surveyor General Burr and by Alessandro Galilei. So there is obviously a tie-up. So what about the significance of Castletown? Connolly was the unofficial Prime Minister of Ireland. He was the undertaker of the King's business. His exact counterpart was England's first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Not surprisingly, Walpole was building Houghton at exactly the same as Castletown. Both had the same function: displays of power, classical language, divulging the dominance of the Whigs, of which they both were, their power as the political elite under George I in England. Both were used for political congresses. When Parliament was in recess, the fate of the nation would be decided in both buildings. And then there is another link-up, which is yet to be fully proven, or another suggested English link, which is with the Lord Lieutenant, who was in Ireland when Castletown was being built, in this case between 20 and 24, Charles Fitzroy, the second Duke of Grafton, one of the patrons of the first edition of Vitruvius Britannicus, great patron of the arts. His son married Lord Burlington's second daughter, Dorothy. He is known to have stayed in Castletown during the building process. He got on very closely with William Connolly. So, that's the kind of headache that is behind the design of the greatest Palladian house conceived in Ireland, the first Neo-Palladian house built in Ireland. Edward Lovett Pearce, this young architect who is the young architect who is given the most credit for the creation of Castletown, the linkage of the colonnade Ionic order with the giant order in the cubic 50-foot hall entrance hall. The plan is attributed to Lovett Pearce. The plan with its spinal circulation corridor comes straight from Coleshill. The plan is entirely formal, with an axial route through public, semi-public, and into a sequence of increasingly private rooms. This is the formula that was developed in the Italian Renaissance. This is the formula that the French refined in the 17th century, and here it is in Ireland, finally, in Castletown in the 1720s. The public rooms are finished in plaster, in a faux masonry. The smaller rooms have got this sort of social hierarchy of being fitted out in wainscot. There's a hierarchy in the furnishings. So the grand rooms had furniture all made in Ireland in the style of William Kent. The secondary furniture was mahogany furniture in a much more relaxed style, in this flamboyant, what the Knight of Glyn used to call grunt and groan style, where the furniture was literally about to move across the room. But Castletown from its very beginning was seen as what was, I quote, the epitome of the kingdom. It was meant to be an example of national capability. And that's part of the prowess in the scale of its creation. So you went from the front hall into the saloon. This is it stripped in the 1980s, showing its early decoration, which was clearly the same as Drumcondra in an oiled oak finish with giant pilasters flanking the door. And from there you went through a sequence of spaces the apartment, an antechamber, the bedroom, and closets. Very much in the formula as evolving at this time, by William Kent, with strong cornices, coving, compartmented ceilings, and the bedroom dominated by a grand state bed, exactly the same as was to be found at Houghton. So the splendor of Castletown is epitomized by the funerary monument designed by carved by Thomas Carter, which was erected in the 1730s to the memory of William Connolly, who built the house and ultimately paid for, and in memory of his wife, Catherine. So Castletown was sort of finished in 1729. The Speaker died in 1729. And at exactly that moment, the Parliament House was created. And it is, you know, this sort of madness in Ireland that the biggest country house was built at the beginning of this new Palladian period. And then this monumental, one of the most monumental classical buildings in Europe in the 18th century was erected in the heart of Dublin. And it's such a sort of symbol of confidence in Ireland's future. It's an act of bravery, almost sort of challenging England, that Ireland could have a Parliament House of such scale. This is an 18th century drawing, which gives you an idea of what the effect this building must have had in the huddled, muddled medieval street layout. It was designed by Edward Lovett Pearce. He had been brought back from his grand tour in Rome in 1726 to work on Castletown. He immediately moved on to the Parliament House. So you have this forecourt that you see here, direct access to the House of Commons here, which is an octagonal space to house the 700 members of Parliament, 300 members of Parliament, with a gallery for 700 up above. It's clearly based on the Pantheon. And, and then off to one side is the House of Lords, which we'll look at in a moment. So what is the Houses of Parliament? It's a Roman Forum. It's a great public democratic space. It is using antiquity, you know, to work so effectively for this new confident Ireland that was emerging. Wellesley says that the actual format comes from the Villa Sarego by Palladio. But the antique references are everywhere. The corridors that ran around the original debating Parliament chamber are these vaulted, repetitive spaces, clearly based on the loggia in the Vatican by Raphael, which Lovett Pearce would have seen on his grand tour. The House of Lords is a funny combination of the medieval Great Hall with its tapestries, but it's also a Roman basilica with its vaulted ceiling. And the apsidal end is directly lifted from the Temple of Venus Rome and Rome in the Roman Forum. So it's an incredibly sophisticated ensemble out of the blue. So what about villas? The Plinian ideal of the country villa was emulated, obviously, by Palladio and others in the 15th and the 16th century. The whole concept of the Renaissance villa, very much taken up by the Neo-Palladians in England in the early 18th century, and absolutely in Ireland. So Lovett Pearce dies in 1733, a very young man. But while the Parliament House is being built, he builds for a kinsman the most perfect Palladian villa, like La Rotunda, crowning a hill in the northeast of Ireland in County Cavan. And it plays this sort of game. It's pretending that it's a single-story villa on a basement with an attic floor. It's a monster of a house with, in fact, 3 floors, fantastically grand rooms. And it's this sort of stripped classical harmony and empty balance that is so notable about Bellamont. It is a much more sophisticated building in a strange way than Castletown. The hall leads on into a series of plaster paneled reception rooms with these wonderful Jonesian coffered ceilings. And then there's this innovation. On the upper floor, you have this bedroom landing, top lit space like something from, an excavation in the Roman Forum. And this becomes a formula that appears time and time again in Irish country houses during the 18th century. So Pearse dies, and his clerk of works on the Parliament House project is a German called Richard Castle, and he inherits the practice. So you get him suddenly in the mid-decades building a series of villas and country houses, and one of the smallest and cutest is this 40-foot square house in the Irish Midlands called Ledwardstown, very plain, sitting on a nice plinth, only decorated by its Doric pedimented door case. Main rooms are plaster panelled with this hierarchy of the bedrooms and secondary rooms being wainscoted. But Dublin was developing apace. And by the 1730s, the gabled houses were out of fashion. And you have these speculators beginning to develop streets of enormous scale. And one of these, Henrietta Street in the north of Dublin, is such an interesting, it's just built of this series of enormous palazzos. And one of the first, number 9, built for the master of his role, of the rolls, Thomas Carter and his wife, is designed by Edward Lovett Pearse, but this is where Lord Burlington comes in. It is a direct replica of Burlington's design for Lord Mountrath's townhouse in Piccadilly. And number 9 survives pretty intact. Forgive, it's owned by a convent, so the colours are holy, shall we say. It is a big building with almost a quarter of the ground plan, of the plan, being taken up by main and secondary staircases. It's formal. You come in here, you move through this apartment with a bedchamber here. The walls are plaster panelled. You have these heavy, heavy compartmented ceilings again. You have this grand triumphal staircase with the walls plastered with Serlian architectural ornament. And this comes to the main apartment, ending in the main bedchamber. It's an incredibly confident ensemble. And just, this is not really necessarily Palladian, but I just wanted to show you because you love old buildings. And this is a rare survival of a palazzo built by another Dublin entrepreneur, Nathaniel Clements, in the 1730s. But I just wanted to show you the scale of these great, brutal, plain brick facades. The door case and the windows were altered in the late 18th century. But until a couple of years ago, this 1730s interior had not been touched since sometime in the middle of the 19th century in terms of paint. And so you get these wonderful, grand, plaster finished main rooms and then small little wainscoted secondary rooms again. But in terms of early Palladianism, I think the last of the sort of the urban buildings is the only townhouse in Dublin that retains its original use is the Provost House in Trinity, built from 1759 for the Provost, who was a bachelor. And it is designed probably by this architect working in the college, an Englishman called John Smith. It is a replica of Lord Burlington's design for General Wade, and it is a replica of Palladia's published palazzo design with its arcaded piano nobile, entirely masculine inside with a plaster and wood panelled faux masonry in the hall and staircase coming up to a first floor enormous reception room with this screen of Corinthian columns and this magnificent coffered plaster ceiling. So I think we've established that early Palladianism is introducing this language of harmony and balance and very masculine, very monochrome interior decoration. It's creating a strong kind of framework for this new nobility, this new Whig gentry population to kind of cling on to in this rapidly civilizing country. But it's thinking of Giles Worsley and this idea of parallel styles. There was another strand of Palladianism at the same time, and it's overtly Baroque. So here you've got this now sadly gone country house called Summerhill in the middle of Ireland, designed by Lovett Pearse and his pupil. It's Palladian, main block quadrants, pavilions, but it's got these domed towers. It's got this extraordinary sort of theatrical skyline. And Edward Lovett Pearse was, in fact, a second cousin of Sir Thomas Vanbrugh. So there, the great English Baroque architect. So there, there is obviously a cross-referencing going on. And the other house I thought I'd show you very quickly, where theatre is as important as antiquity, is in Powerscourt, a house built southeast of Dublin in the wilds of the Wicklow Mountains, huddled under this volcanic cone called the Sugarloaf. So it is a remodeling of an earlier house with sort of very small wings and tiny quadrants. You enter into this almost grotto-like entrance hall with this exaggerated coffered ceiling that is absolutely reminiscent of some of Inigo Jones's drawings, which is probably coincidental, but it's very much the antique, ancient Rome being replicated. And then you emerge up a staircase to this extraordinary theatrical two-story saloon, which looks out over the mountainous landscape. It is an almost exact contemporary of Lord Burlington's rendition of the York Assembly Rooms, which itself is a recreation of Palladio's drawing of Vitruvius's Basilica, or the famous Egyptian Hall. So it's a pretty pure piece of the ancient world being created in the Wicklow Mountains in the middle decades. So as the 18th century moves on, the momentum increases, and you have the relaxed, rococo, sophisticated, aristocratic styles beginning to evolve from Paris, which were developing in the 1720s, but during the 1730s spread to England and arrive at the end of the 1730s in Ireland, mainly in the form of Swiss-Italian stucadors. So you've got this house here built around an enclosed common area called Stephen's Green, designed by Richard Castle in 1738 for a Hugh Montgomery, an Italian palazzo, heavily rusticated, very masculine, and the whole first floor is given up to a saloon. Yes, it follows the Kentian formula of heavy cornice, coving, compartmented ceiling, all the language of Palladian classicism, but everything is encrusted in this three-dimensional, frankly, Baroque stucco, inspired by Simon Vouet's painted decoration in Versailles. It's the work of Paolo and Filippo, thank you, Franchini, these Swiss-Italian stucadors, who, like the Artari, came up to the British Isles, and the Franchini came to Ireland, and they stayed there until one of them died, until the late 1770s. And this new Rococo stroke Baroque, but certainly more relaxed, colourful style, infuses Neo-Palladianism. And I think you can see it here in this great country house called Rusborough, built again in the Dublin Mountains, southeast of the city, in the early 1740s for the first Earl of Milton, Joseph Leeson. It is obviously a Palladian layout. It's nearly 600 feet long, main block, colonnades, wings, triumphal arches, further wings. It just goes on and on, like this lecture. The contrast to that is that the main block, like Bellomont, is trying to be a single-story, tiny, teeny little villa. And so you've got this kind of anomaly being created between the diminutive and also the fact that the whole building is executed in this very rugged local granite. It's obviously Neo-Palladian. It is looking for the Villa Badour, for these freestanding colonnades. The end pavilions with these blind Serlian openings are directly lifted from the Villa Poiana. But look at the inside. You're suddenly in a new realm of color and sumptuous and absolute luxury. Chimney pieces by Thomas Carter, extraordinary Rococo, Dublin-made furniture and picture frames, and walls hung in textiles. And the Franchini stucco work is now being reduced. The great fat angels are turning into tiny little putti, and the Rococo acanthus ornament and the vegetative decoration is really beginning to just become a light-hearted, frothy musical background. So Ireland adopts this Rococo style with an alacrity that is part of the passionate Irish nature. But then you get this kind of crazy duality setting in, where you get a house like Douth Hall being built on the top of a hill, and it is clearly a town palazzo. It's extremely masculine, and it's got this bizarrely exotic Rococo interior carried out probably by Robert West, which is inspired by French boiserie engravings. And there is this, and you kind of accept it in Ireland, but when you stand back from it, it is a strange sort of contrast of styles. And it's seen again and again here in Castletown Cox. You've got this Palladian layout, a house actually inspired by Buckingham House, now Palace in London, where you've got this very architectonic exterior, but then this frothy, light-hearted interior, which sort of belies the seriousness of the Neo-Palladianism. So back to the urban environment, and we have public buildings being executed as if they were in the style of country houses. So Leinster House, built in the early 1740s, it is copying Lord Burlington's townhouse in Piccadilly with its triumphal arch entry and stables and forecourt, designed by Richard Castle. And a little over a decade later, the first maternity hospital in the world was commenced by the same architect. But it was set up, it was built, as a working maternity hospital, but designed and laid out as a country house. It's following the Coles Hill formula. It's got apartments, but they're all wards. And so you enter through the hall, up the grand staircase, and I'll show you what you come to in a minute, because the building with its wings on either side and its gardens behind it was entirely designed to raise money. It's a big entertainment complex where the ancillary buildings raise money to keep the wards actually functioning. And instead of a saloon on the first floor, you have this extraordinary chapel with this amazing stucco ceiling by Bartholomew Cromillion, which is inspired by these early 18th century Italian engravings. The work was never completed because Bartholomew Most, who commissioned the project, died in 1759. But it is a sort of an extraordinary, again, a sort of appreciation through contrast with this architectonic exterior and this exotic interior. But one of the reasons I want to show you this is that the secondary stucco doors in this project were Irish stucco doors, learning from Cromillion and from the Franchini brothers. So the secondary plasterwork is this lovely, light-hearted, Rococo, frothy decoration. And they move on after the Rotunda project. And a lot of artisans in the mid-18th century become speculators. So one of them, Robert West, built a series of houses near the Rotunda in the formula you saw earlier. But look at this sort of cacophony of Rococo decoration behind these severe Neo-Palladian facades. It's this wonderful sort of mad flip. And then just before we leave the city, a lot of churches built in the city in the mid-decades. One of them, this St. Thomas's Church, built in the late 1750s, is a replica of Il Redentore in Venice by Palladio. So what about the Irishness of all of this? Pattern books, incredibly important for disseminating these new Palladian designs. And it is the sort of cranky sub-pattern book variety that is so charming about rural Irish Palladianism. A diminutive farmhouse in County Kildare with no quadrants, but just little corner pavilions, and then, barns on either side. This one is really wonderful, surrounded by a formal landscape. Tiny house, literally, it was one room, front to back, and it still survives, but when I photographed it, it was derelict. And what I'm going to ask you is this house Galston, is it closer to Palladio's actual villas that you see, in the Veneto, than somewhere like Colin Campbell's equally tiny Everston in Yorkshire, which is a sort of an English refined version, whereas these are real farmhouses. It's just, you know, it may be the photography is suggestive, but the oddity of Ireland, you know, created these bizarre confections. This now lost house in County Meath, which is just what Maurice Craig called this riot of Palladian windows. Florence Court in Northern Ireland, where, you know, it's all about almost like a Baroque Palladian exaggeration of architectural ornament. But then you get the houses that are just bloody beautiful. And there's a whole series of anonymous villas built around Dublin in the 1760s, which are just so refined and so clever and just play with different aspects of Neo-Palladianism. I haven't got far to go, so just hang in there. The last phase of the 18th century is obviously neoclassicism, where, you know, antiquity is discovered. Does Palladianism die? And it obviously doesn't. And I think part of its brilliance is that it can readapt to the changing expectations of patrons. Lucan House, which Desmond Guinness said is almost like a villa on the Irish Brenta, which is the River Liffey, was built by a series of architects for a fascinating couple, Egmondisham and Elizabeth Vesey. He was the accountant general in Ireland. And it is the quintessential late 18th century neoclassical villa with no real hierarchy of rooms, just a sequence of interesting spaces and a drawing room that thrust itself out into the landscape. And the landscape, this informal landscape with these meandering paths, was at enormous expense created by the Veseys to create this vision of Arcadia in the 1770s. Lucan obviously relates to, I've completely forgotten. I'm not even going to go there. It's by Henry Flitcroft in Woburn Abbey, with this sort of temple pedimented arrangement being replicated. But it's a strange building. James Wyatt, Chambers and other architects were involved. And of course, the interior is now neoclassical. It is, you know, the antique, the arabesque, the ornament that Raphael discovered under the Roman Forum is being replicated, and Rococo has died like that. And one of the interesting things about Irish neoclassical plasterwork is that it does have an energy. It's got this, you know, it's not the dead hand of Adam by any means. And of course, it's because the stucadors, who were used to the vibrance of the Rococo, were being chained down to the, you know, arabesque and the husk, but the energy is still pulsating behind them. So just part of this anomaly, this paralleling of styles, big Palladian house built in the 1770s in the west of Ireland, Dunsandle, by this very wonderfully painted by Reynolds, Dana Staley. Most of the rooms were decorated in a flamboyant Rococo style. But if you go to the ruins today, you see that all the rooms on the front of the building are in a severe neoclassical style, and they are created at the same date. So there was no, you know, they were obviously not fussed by this, you know, mixing of their cocktails. Possibly the finest neoclassical building in the British Isles is Castle Coole, designed by James Wyatt, in the far northeast corner of Ireland. It is a bizarrely un-Irish house. It should be in the home counties. It's built of imported Portland stone. It is a Palladian formula, main block, colonnades, wings. But what is different and what has changed, it is now a Grecian temple. It's like Segesta or Selinus in Sicily, atop its hill, surrounded by, you know, olive groves, except it's Fermanagh and it's dry 1 day in 20. It's a completely different world. But the Palladian element lives on. And, you know, the kitchens are in the wings, but they're actually under the ground. But you have this, as in Lucan, this wonderful circuit of rooms and this bow which thrusts the main reception room out into the landscape. But isn't it extraordinary how we've traveled in the space of almost an hour from the robust early 18th century Castletown or Henrietta Street, and yet we are still within the confines of the Neo-Palladian language in this uptight, chaste, world of the plasterwork designed by James Wyatt and executed by Joseph Rose. Most of it was brought over from England in crates and precast before it got to Ireland. So Ireland's greatest neoclassical architect is James Gandon, who produced a series of wonderful neoclassical public buildings in Dublin. It could be argued that the Customs House is, in fact, a main block colonnades and pavilions, that Palladianism lives on within the public sphere. But I thought it's a bit more fun just to note that actually I think it's in a couple of his surviving villas, where the spirit of what Palladio was trying to do is realer. You know, Pliny's descriptions of his Laurentian villa beside the sea outside Rome could be applied to this little villa built for the painter William Ashford on the shores of Dublin Bay. It's just such a simple little cottage Georgian structure made neoclassical by its, you know, niches and roundels and blind panels. But this is more sophisticated. So this is a house built again outside Dublin for a publisher called James Woodmason. And it is this playing of, you know, temple formula and pavilions and combining them into one small villa that makes it both Palladian and late 18th century and charming at the same time. When we get to the early 19th century, I think we just become too exhausted to really be interested in whether this building of 1840 is or isn't Neo-Palladian, because it's moving into the heaviness and the hybrid nature of so much 19th century architecture. So I thought I'd just end with a couple of quick images of, you know, what we were talking about earlier, Spencer and I, about, you know, the sort of revivalism and how healthy, you know, Neo-Palladian has become in the British Isles, as of course in this country, where here in the late 1970s, above Rusborough in the wilds of County Wicklow, on one of the former axes behind the house in the landscape, a Dublin doctor built this wonderful, perfect Tuscan villa with its south-facing portico overlooking the great Richard Castle ensemble below. In the late 90s and the early 2000s, the great patron of Irish conservation, the late Fred Grabeel, built a series of pavilions to house his huge collection of Irish art on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean in the southwest of Ireland in County Kerry. And within these are like Italian Renaissance casinas, where, you know, parties would leave the main building and, you know, seek entertainment. One contains a drawing room with chinoiserie paper and a Chippendale set of furniture designed or made for David Garrick, and the other contains his library, Grabeel's library of 18th century Irish volumes. They're extraordinary spaces designed by the architect John O'Connell. But the final building, I think, is possibly the most remarkable symbol of this continuation, and that's a house completed about a decade ago for a young family, designed by Quinlan Terry and Associates, and it's Kilboy. And it's, you know, typically Irish, you know, up and down history. Kilboy was built in the 1770s as a sort of a neoclassical Palladian house. It was burnt during the Troubles in 1922. It was rebuilt without its active attic floor. That was demolished in the 1950s, and another house built on its basement, a bungalow, that was burnt in about 2007, and this new house built in its place. It's built of Balnasloe, which comes from the west of Ireland, grey limestone with a very fine, slightly yellow lime render. Because it's a 21st century house, it is it is playing games, and the front hall is architectonic and early 18th century monochrome Palladian. You go through the screen and suddenly you've moved into the neoclassical period, but it's a fairly seamless move. And this wonderful rotunda stair hall obviously relates to the Pantheon, but in fact is directly inspired by a late 18th century house called Townley Hall by an important neoclassical Irish architect called Francis Johnson. And then the other rooms are a sort of a sequence of sort of more Regency and Rococo revival spaces. So, you know, Giles Worsley's arguments persist in terms of the coexistence of different styles in the 18th century and in the 21st century. And I think the final affirmation is given to Country Life magazine, who proudly announced in 2016 that it was the greatest new house in Europe. I think Palladio is alive. Thank you very much. Actually, I can't bear questions because, you know, it's always too painful. But does anybody have any ideas about this idea of the cottage Georgian? You know, something that is these single-story, modest houses that are so prolific in Virginia in particular. So where do you think all that comes from? What's the, you know, when you are looking for their lineage, what's the inspiration?
For me, I think a lot of it is due simply the, the, the shortage of money, necessity of.
So it's a diminution of aspiration.
But to still create something that had that gravitas, that sense of stature, accomplishment, and establishing a place in the middle of nowhere.
But nothing is without precedent. See, that's the thing. Or maybe I'm just being too pedantic.
What's amazing to me is the extent to which all of those books you spoke of, Addie Langley, the A Party of London Incense, all of these were being sort of shipped over from the UK. Jefferson bought at least 2 sets of all of it. One lost in a fire when the Capitol burned, and distributed them to not only his gentlemen friends but his builders as well.
Yeah. So the pattern book is the disseminator. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Delightful. That's what I love about those small little pavilions you showed.
The Kabyle ones. Yeah. Yeah.
So
because they're not really Palladio they're more sewn maybe. I mean, they sort of they pull on all sorts of references. Anyway, no, I think it's, but I mean, so sad that Giles Worsley died. He was, you know, 10 years younger than me, and he died in the early 1990s. And did you ever come across him, Madison? I mean, he was, you know, and he just was so brilliant that he was able to look at conventional thought and say, well, it's not sequential. And he's, you know, he claimed that the Gothic revival never died in England, and that, you know, Elizabethan, you know, that you know, the Gothic continued through the 17th century, through the Oxbridge colleges, and right. You know, just lots of things that nobody had ever really thought about, and was staring them in the face. Well, yes. Yeah.
Terry trained them.
Yeah.
But that whole cast of characters that were capable of playing a very varied sort of game.
Yeah.
I think is just so enchanting.
You're talking about sort of recently dead architects, or yeah. Yeah. No. Well, I know. Anyway, listen. I know a lot of you have been to Ireland. Dead silence. Yes. Good. Sorry. Come, because, you know, it's a. You know, in Williamsburg, we'll be talking about the state of conservation in Ireland today, and maybe it's no different anywhere, but it's a funny time. And, you know, there's nothing like an outsider, you know, a visitor, to point out the obvious, to slap us in the face and say, you know, this just is not good enough, you know, do better. So, yeah. You know, there's a lot of work to be done and so on. But if any of you have any comments, do just say, sorry. Nothing. Good. That's fine. No, yeah.
You addressed this a little bit, but I just can't seem to reconcile the restrained exterior with these kind of wild rococo interiors. They weren't at all bothered by the lack of coherence between the inside and the
I
outside.
don't think the schizophrenic gene in the Irish DNA has been fully explored for obvious reasons. But it is, I mean, it is fascinating. It's a dichotomy. And you know, in England is so much more reserved. England never accepted the Rococo with the same abandon. It was, you know, with exceptions. There's a sort of a vein of buildings in Gloucestershire and and there's an interesting link that's been made between Ireland and the Bristol Channel. The English are more reserved, and therefore Palladianism is more consistent. But you know, you say it, and there's always an exception to that. But in Ireland, it's exceptional. You know, the breaking of rules, and I think it's, you know, it's part of the, you know, the frustration that, you know, people like us have with our, you know, in my case, Irish people, or you with, you know, your country folk, that, you know, national characteristics prevail, whether it comes to conservation or creation. I would need to, I think the psychoanalysis has yet to be done. And actually, seriously, I think that, you know, the whole business about middle-class patronage is something that, you know, I mean, I'm not an academic, as I've said, and you know, if I was young, I'd love to start, you know, researching again, because I think that, you know, what like, you know, like a lot of these projects were tradesmen who were bettering themselves by taking on these speculative projects. And so, you know, there were no patrons involved. So what was in their minds? Was it just bravado? Was it, you know, were these, you know, I think the thought process, and the trouble is because, you know, there are no records, they didn't keep diaries, you know, as is always the case of people who are too busy to do all these things. We don't know. But I think it shouldn't stop us doing the Freud on them a bit. Anyway, guys, I think we're being thrown out. But sorry, yes.
How they didn't have any books, whereby they would be owned by the son of a carpenter, but they might be 20 to 30 years behind England, particularly in rural areas of Virginia.
Yes.
I mean, I can see that my own house has got one, and then the living room was done 20 years later, but different time.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, but the same people doing the work? No. But is that a shift in taste in the owners, or just what was available?
I think
What's available? Yeah. But isn't the tradition, early this morning, I was looking at a book that you had, Cordelia, and I've forgotten. So who was Jefferson's master mason, who came to study in the university, who went on to become an architect, a builder? Is it Robert Mills? You've got a book downstairs.
Oh,
Dinsmore. But is that quite common here in Virginia, this idea of tradesmen becoming really quite sophisticated designers? Do you think?
In that, like Central Virginia has produced a lot of these sorts of characters.
It's exceptional. Yeah.
I mean, in urban areas like Philadelphia, especially, this was a thing that was happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, some of our best architects were
Rose.
along that, like
Yeah.
Peter Harrison in coming into Newport, and then William Buckland at
Yes,
Duncan
of
Hall,
course.
much like
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Central Virginia is.
Yeah. But you're saying maybe Philadelphia as well.
Yeah, there are
These sort of centers. Yeah. Anyway, guys, thank you for coming very, very much indeed. And it's just so nice to be here.